Hi everyone! Welcome back. So we're going to use a different kind of reference this lesson. We're going to use videos instead. Video references. Why should we use them in the first place?
I'll explain to you why we're using video references, what keyframes are, show you the keyframes I chose, as well as the gestures you can draw from them. Then, I'll show you the 5 principles to keep in mind when choosing and drawing keyframes once you practice this at home. After that, the rest of the class will show a screencast of me drawing and sharing my thought process when referencing keyframes.
Using video reference helps you enhance your art by analyzing the way bodies move and propel themselves forward or in any direction. The best way to analyze the way a body moves is by choosing keyframes from your video. But what are keyframes?
Keyframes are basically a visual summary of the progression of movement a person makes in a video. Usually, a person's movements in a video can be summarized into 4 to 6 keyframes, give or take.
To be specific, they are shots that define the starting and ending points of any smooth transition. To show you what I mean, I'll share a video I referenced of a person falling down. I'll show you the video first, then I'll share the keyframes I took from them.
These are the keyframes I ended up choosing. These keyframes show the rough overview of how the position of every part of his body changes as he falls down. And these are the gesture drawings I made based off them.
I'll play you the video again, but slowed down this time, then talk you through how I chose keyframes from it. What I'm doing whenever I'm choosing my keyframes is observing whenever there's a change in direction, when the model moves into another action or falls into another pose.
I only choose a keyframe when there's a shift in movement or a shift in weight from one part of the body to another. So don't choose every single frame as a reference to draw. You want to limit yourself to choosing and drawing only good keyframes, the ones that follow the 5 principles. Let's go over what these principles are. The first principle is that you have to pick poses with clear silhouettes and a clear line of action.
Remember all that we learned in the first lesson? All that still applies here.
You want the keyframe to have as few confusing or obscure elements as possible. If any part is hidden, it should be hidden in its entirety. A clear line of action is the overall main movement of the body, which, as I said in the first lesson, should show a clear direction in its movement. The second principle is to pick poses that show anticipation.
This pose shows exactly how one action leads to the next. Let's go back to the video of a man falling down to see an example of a pose that shows anticipation.
Here, he goes from trying to reach up to falling down and grabbing onto the fireplace.
There's anticipation in the first keyframe because we're anticipating him to fall down in the next frame. We see that because of how precariously he's tiptoeing upwards on just one foot and how far to his left he's leaning in this pose.
This preludes the following keyframe. He's falling down and trying to grab onto the fireplace. Seeing this keyframe as a follow-up to the first one is unsurprising because we see the lack of balance in this previous pose. It hints at what's to come.
This is another example from a video of someone jumping. I'll let it play again, but in slow motion this time.
Here are all the keyframes I got from this video.
Among them, this keyframe best illustrates what I mean by a pose that shows anticipation.
Here, she's crouching down with her arms back. You can see from her pose that she's ready to launch herself forward. It makes the next keyframe, where she's already in the air, make sense.
A pose that shows good anticipation will depict a person about to move their body's position. In the first one, the change happened by accident. In this one, the change happened on purpose.
Now, on to the third principle. Make every pose purposeful. Don't draw extra poses. When we look through the entire video, we see many poses that he shifts into. But why do we only choose these 6 keyframes instead of drawing all the other in-between poses, like this, or this one?
The reason why is because we want to prioritize the poses that look best when it's taken out of its context.
A pose like this reads much clearer to the viewer if it's used in a still illustration, comic, storyboard, or any artwork that features people.
The point of drawing gestures is not only to understand how to draw fluid movements, it's also to learn how to draw gestures that look easily readable to anyone who will be viewing your artwork. Being picky about the keyframes that you choose is a good way to learn what poses will work best for your artwork. This is especially important for those of you who want to get into animation in the future, because that will be the main thing you'll be doing at your job.
4th principle, create confident lines, not scratchy lines. This one applies to drawing your keyframes rather than choosing them.
I mentioned this briefly in the first 2 lessons, but I'll reiterate it here.
Drawing confident lines takes much less time than scratchy ones. It also forces you to really try drawing and committing to the line of action you drew. It's okay if the gestures you draw look wrong. What's really needed is to draw it confidently, then move on, even if the gesture doesn't look nice.
It's always better to restart your gesture drawing if you make a mistake, rather than fussing over refining just one keyframe.
After many rounds of consistent practice, you'll notice that your latest drawing will look significantly better than your first.
Drawing scratchy lines will only slow you down, so keep moving forward.
Our 5th and last principle is to start by drawing the skeleton, otherwise known as the 3 key elements.
This was already mentioned back in lesson 1, but I'm emphasizing it again here because this is the base rules of all gesture drawing.
It also helps a lot to roughly sketch out how the limbs are positioned right after you draw these 3 key elements. After that, you can draw the rest of the body.
Alright, now that we know why we're using video references and what our 5 principles are, let's get into the screencast. So I mainly pulled my video references from YouTube, but you can reference any website that hosts videos. Let's look at that video of a person falling down. Because we need to pause and choose keyframes from this segment, we'll need to slow down the video in order to make that easier. Let's go into settings and slow the video down to 0.25 speed. The reason why we slow the video down is so that we can see the movements clearer. We'll have an easier time pausing and choosing keyframes we want to draw this way. I usually start out by scrubbing through the video to find which poses look clearest and shows them leading into their next action. I will play, pause and rewind at slow motion repeatedly to get a better sense of how the action starts and which pose I would like to end at. For this gesture drawing session, I chose this pose as my first keyframe and this one as my final reference keyframe. I chose these 2 references because they have clear silhouettes and a clear line of action. It's best to choose the starting and ending keyframes first before you choose all the other ones. Once you understand how a model's pose starts out and how they end up, you'll better understand how to choose keyframes that best represent the sequence of actions that lead up to the final pose. For this gesture drawing session, the end result is this posture. Every keyframe you choose should be analyzed in this way so that you view the gesture drawing in context to its main movement instead of just as a still image. We will also be using a timer for every keyframe that we draw. All the videos of myself drawing have been sped up by 2 times. I started by drawing in the shoulders and hips, then tried capturing the line of action. I had to redraw it a few times because I realized he isn't leaning that much to his left yet, as he's only just starting to reach upwards. Then, I drew in roughly how he's stretching out his limbs. I drew out his left arm reaching up, but I didn't draw his fingers on his left hand because what's important is to capture the overall gesture. I finished off by drawing in his legs, his left leg on his tiptoe, while his right leg is pointing upwards and outwards to balance himself. After that, I had to choose the next keyframe. To do that, I had to scrub through the video again multiple times. As mentioned before, the second keyframe I chose was this one. Although this pose is similar to the first one, there are subtle key differences between them.
He's leaning further to his left here. His arm is stretched out higher and his balance is teetering over to the left more dramatically. His right leg is also pushed up higher because he's trying to overcompensate for how much he's leaning to his left and for the amount of weight he's putting on his left leg. You can also tell that his left foot won't be able to keep him grounded, and we need this pose to show why he ends up falling down.
The first keyframe isn't leaning as precariously to the left, so it doesn't really look like he's going to fall over. This is why we need to choose this keyframe as a follow-up, so that it will lead to the next one.
We start with the line of action, then capture the angle of the shoulders and hips as usual. I roughly mark out the way his legs are positioned so I can draw them out later in case time runs out. When drawing in his left arm, I exaggerated how much his arm is trying to reach upwards and drew it leaning more to his right. This is the hint that he's starting to overcompensate for his body losing balance, starting to fall on his left side. I did the same when drawing his legs in. I made his left leg have more of a dramatic lean than shown in the reference. This difference becomes way more obvious when you compare the finished gesture drawing with the previous one I drew. He's leaning much further to his left and his leg is clearly losing balance, indicating how his body will fall. I went with this pose next because it's clear and shows him grabbing onto the fireplace, bracing his left shin flat on the ground to buffer his fall. His right leg kicks up really high to compensate since gravity is pulling him to fall on his left. I drew his shoulders and hips in first, then extended the line for his hips far to the right because his right leg is tilting in a similar direction. The original image doesn't show his leg kicking up as high, but I decided to exaggerate and dramatize the angle to emphasize how imbalanced he is and to make him look like he's falling down hard. Whether or not to accentuate many movements in a pose is up to you. If you're new to gesture drawing and don't know when it's suitable to exaggerate a pose, you can stick to drawing what you observe from your references for now. The change between this and the previous pose is stark. He's halfway towards the ground now and is holding on to the fireplace out of desperation. It goes from him trying to reach upwards to him losing his balance, then falling down. While falling down, his body's knee-jerk reaction is to try and lessen the blow. So the only thing that's hitting the ground at the moment is his left shin, trying to minimize the damage to his body. I chose this as the next keyframe because we need to show how his hands start to slip away from the fireplace because gravity is pulling him down and now he's fully fallen onto his left side. I drew in the tricky elements first, marked out all his limbs, then drew in his torso and his hands slipping off the fireplace. I wasn't sure exactly where his legs would come out from, mainly because I didn't indicate his torso's length. So I circled in roughly where his bum is to make it easier to tell. His left leg is bent, so it's foreshortened, which is why it looks much shorter than his right leg. For context, foreshortening is a distortion that's seen by the eye when an object or figure is viewed from a distance or at an unusual angle. In art, foreshortening is a way of drawing an object or figure with depth.
As I said before in lesson 2, don't worry too much about this topic for now, because it won't be relevant in your home assignment and I'll explain it further in a future lesson. I only brought it up briefly here because I used this technique when drawing this particular keyframe. I scrubbed through the video again to try and figure out how to connect the previous keyframe to the final one.
After going through it a few times over, I settled on this one, where he's turning halfway from lying on his left side to rolling on his back. I drew in his shoulders first, then his hips, and checked the reference again to see if they are tilted to the same degree. His hips are at a steeper angle than his shoulders. Then I roughed out his line of action and marked out the way his limbs are positioned, drawing his legs in first since they are trickier to capture compared to his arms. I drew in his shoulder blades to make it clearer that we are seeing his back view. When you see this final gesture in comparison to all the previous drawings, the progression of movement becomes clear. Here, he's rolling onto his back, then falling to his side. We started off reaching upwards to losing balance, trying to brace his fall, losing grip, now rolling off to his side.
As shown before, this will be our final keyframe because he has a clear silhouette and his big movements end here.
His shoulders and hips were fairly easy to capture here, so was his line of action, which I figured was his spine connecting to the movement of his right leg. Once again, I marked out all his limbs and quickly drew in the bottom plane of his jaw so that it's clear we are seeing the underside of his chin. Then I drew in his back lying flat on the ground and his legs. I left the arms as the final part to draw because I felt that his legs would be more complicated to capture than his arms.
Now that we have drawn all the keyframes, we can see how he ended up in this position.
Compared to the last one, he's now fully lying on his back. His right leg is more bent and his head is looking to the ceiling instead of to his left. Bringing it back to the beginning, we see that his movement goes from reaching up to losing his balance to bracing his fall, losing grip, then rolling onto his back and finally coming to a stop once he's lying on the ground and looking up to the ceiling.
Now that you know how to pick keyframes from video references, here's your assignment for the lesson.
Find 3 video references online to reference in the same way that I did, and give yourself 1 minute for every key pose that you draw. You can also share it as a project alongside other students in this class.
The next lesson will also feature a video reference. This time, it will show a gymnast doing her routine.
So that lesson will be for students who are looking to push themselves further, and for those who are more advanced in their gesture drawing practice.
To those of you who are true beginners, I don't suggest you try this because it's quite complicated to follow, so I would suggest you guys to skip to lesson 5 instead.
If you're feeling confident or curious, however,
Go ahead, and I wish you the best of luck. All the best guys, and I'll see you in the next lesson.